Hello, my name is Luke Howd, and welcome back to Luke Talks. This is episode number 2. Now, it's been a while since I've kind of made a video. The last time I made a video, I was a senior at Muskingum University. The last video will be down in the description if you want to go take a look at that. It's kind of a "What is religion?" video. It's a very fun video that I make. So today is going to be a little bit of a different video. Today I'm going to be talking about Ruth and what it means for the church today. So without further ado, cue the intro. This semester, I've had the privilege to really focus in on the book of Ruth. I've got to explore its nuances, its ins, its outs, and really discover how such of an amazing writing Ruth is. Unfortunately, there are some in the church today who ignore this writing, mainly because it's part of the Old Testament. And today, writings in the Old Testament have the stigma that it doesn't really pertain to the church, that it's too old or too complicated and not enough Jesus in it to be worth much. However, this just isn't true. While certainly there is little reference to Jesus in the Old Testament, the Old Testament shows how God is faithful to his people, and, as in the case with Ruth, it gives the church examples of how people, despite their circumstances, can still help and love their neighbors. To prove this point, let's first break down the Ruth narrative. Ruth starts with a family from Bethlehem, and they're moving to the land of Moab because of a famine. The family consists of Elimelech, Naomi, and their 2 sons, Mahlon and Kilion. While in Moab, the 2 sons marry Ruth and Orpah, 2 Moabite women. Unfortunately, this is where the story takes a turn for the worst. Elimelech and his 2 sons die, leaving Naomi a widow and without sons, and leaving Ruth and Orpah as widows. So Naomi decides that, because of this situation, to go back to Israel and encourages her 2 daughter-in-laws to return to their families. Orpah listens to Naomi and returns to her Moabite family. But Ruth, on the other hand, out of a daring and loving move, commits herself to Naomi. In verses 16 through 17 of chapter 1, Ruth tells Naomi, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. May the Lord do this, and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." And so Ruth, wholly and selflessly, commits herself to Naomi. So Naomi and Ruth, both being widows, return to Bethlehem at the beginning of the harvest season. So once they have returned to Bethlehem, Ruth goes to a field to glean in order to get some food. This is where we are introduced to the character Boaz. Boaz is described as a kinsman of Naomi, who is both rich and prominent. He has his own fields and even his own workers. And so Ruth ends up in his fields, and Boaz takes notice of her. He mentions that he has heard of her commitment to Naomi, and allows her to glean from him. He also feeds her a meal and insists on his workers being extra generous to Ruth while she gleans from him. Eventually, Ruth goes back to Naomi, and Naomi hears of Boaz. Now, admittedly, this is when the Ruth story starts to feel a little foreign to our 21st century Western ears. Naomi hears of Boaz and devises a plan for Ruth and Boaz to get married. She tells Ruth to go to Boaz at the threshing floor, wait till he's asleep, and uncover his feet and lie down. Now, there's a lot of talk about what this actually means. Typically, commentators will say that Ruth is uncovering Boaz's lower body while he's asleep in order to grab his attention. Regardless, this shows Boaz Ruth's proposal. That is that Ruth wants Boaz to redeem Naomi's family through some form of levirate marriage. So Boaz agrees, but he also recognizes that there's someone that is more closely related to Naomi than him. So the next day, he meets the next of kin at the city gate and asks the next of kin if he will redeem Naomi's land in front of the elders. At first he agrees, but decides to decline once he figures out that it would include a marriage with a Moabite woman, Ruth. Boaz redeems Naomi's land and takes Ruth as his wife. They get married and they have a kid, and Naomi is blessed by the women of the town. The narrative ends here with a genealogy of Ruth's son that eventually leads to the King of David. So, what does this story, this book, have to do with the church? How can this story help us with our walks with Jesus? There's certainly no story about Jesus here. In fact, compared to other books of the Bible, God is less of a main presence and more explicitly depicted as working in the background. But I assure you, Ruth is a rich and important narrative within the Bible that shouldn't be ignored by Christians. It serves as a wonderful example of three different people from different backgrounds showing love and compassion to other people who need help. First, look at Ruth. She's a Moabite widow in a foreign land that is typically hostile towards her people. Yet, despite her situation, she lovingly commits herself to Naomi. Despite of not having a husband and going to an area hostile to her people, she helps Naomi out. Similarly, Naomi returns this love back to Ruth. Naomi, despite being a widow, like Ruth, helps Ruth by securing Ruth and Boaz's marriage. Both Ruth and Naomi show that even in a marginalized state, people can still help those who need it. In many ways, us Christians can take this as an example. Maybe you are a Christian and you are part of a marginalized group or not in a great financial situation. Even in those situations, like Ruth, like Naomi, you can still help somebody out and maybe make their life that much more easier. And through that action, you can also glorify God. Now, maybe Ruth and Naomi are not relatable. Maybe, if you're like me, you are not necessarily part of a marginalized group or in a foreign country that is hostile to your ethnic people. Then there is still Boaz to look towards as an example. Again, Boaz was considered a rich and prominent man. Yet, in his elevated social status, he still shows compassion to those who are in a marginalized status. In fact, Boaz uses his elevated social status to show Ruth generosity and compassion by giving her more to glean from. In essence, Boaz can be an example for those in the church who are not in a marginalized status, that out of our elevated social status, that we can still help those who are in a marginalized status, that we can give to the poor and show compassion to the marginalized. And maybe you're not part of that marginalized group. Maybe you are that, wealthy individual or, just has a good, normal social situation. You can still give to those who are poor, who are part of the marginalized. In fact, I think that is important for us as a church to do. When we look at Boaz, he, out of his elevated social situation, gave to Ruth. He allowed her to glean from him and even gave her extra stuff So I think that's really important as Christians to kind of follow that example, to give to those who are poor, to help those who are marginalized. So that's what Ruth has for the modern church. That is how Ruth can better our walks with Jesus, by being a reminder to us that despite our social situations, we can still help those who are in need. Again, maybe you are a Ruth or a Naomi-like person. Maybe you are marginalized. Maybe you're part of a ethnic people who are treated lesser than other people. You can still help other people in your situation. Or maybe you're more relatable to Boaz, who is a rich and prominent man who, has a fairly normal social situation. You can still help those who are in need and who are marginalized. And I think that is a main takeaway that we can take as a church, that because we follow Jesus, we can do these things and help other people, even despite our situations. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Luke Talks. If you haven't already, go and read Ruth. Rediscover the richness of the Old Testament. Go find how it can deepen your journey as a Christian. If you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe, and thank you for watching.